Last week we talked about Noah, and I had mentioned that we like to call that story the story of the flood, but that's not technically accurate because it wasn't so much describing a flood as it was describing the uncreating of the earth, the allowing for the waters below and the waters above to completely consume the creation in the middle, according to the way that ancient peoples understood how the world was put together. So I called last week's session Do-Over instead of The Flood. And this week I was trying to decide what to call this one, and I decided that I was going to call it Do-Over Again, because we're kind of getting to another major radical transition in the process of kind of God negotiating, if you will, how to interact with these crazy creatures called humans. So kind of just to recap, we are working with this definition of violence as actions that oppose God and God's desires for the world. Violence is destruction that has a particular motivation of greed, selfishness, desire for power and control, and has to do with defiance of God's authority, attempting to kind of step out of your rightful place in the created order. So I wanted to also reread from last week this really powerful quote from Walter Brueggemann that I read that talks about what the story of Noah teaches us about God, where it talks about God's grief over humanity. And Brueggemann says, God's creative power is invitational and permissive, not coercive and authoritarian. God desires for humanity to be turned toward God in their thoughts and behavior, but doesn't demand it. God's way of bringing the world to trust and obedience is not through force and fear, but through anguish and grief and God's entering into the pain and brokenness of the world. And so, to me, that gives this story a whole new perspective. And the idea about how violence works, a whole new perspective, that because God has chosen to create us and give us will and not to demand that we behave the way God wants us to make us truly other than God, God has to allow us to choose. If we can't choose, if we have no choice, if we're just automatons, then there is actually no creation. God has just created another God, another version of God's self. And so in order to have a relationship with something that is not God, God has to allow that thing to kind of have its own personality, own decision making. And so in order to bring that creation into relationship with God, into right relationship with God, God chooses not to use force and fear, because we all know that that never works to create real good relationships, but through mourning, through experiencing anguish and grief, God participates in the pain and the brokenness of the world that we cause to ourselves, but God chooses to participate in that pain and brokenness in order to repair those relationships, in order to build that trust, to develop that relationship between creation and God. And I think that makes a lot of sense from a Christian perspective. I think that what is happening with Jesus and coming into the world and experiencing pain and suffering on the cross, those same themes are present. So if we follow those same ideas through the Bible, I think we can find some really interesting and helpful perspectives to take. And then finally, at the end of the Noah story, we came to the place where God concedes. God says, that these people are obviously not going to be able to live by my will for nonviolence, my desire for complete nonviolence. And I've tried destroying everything and starting again. That didn't do anything. So instead, I'm going to work with these violent creatures instead of destroying them. I'm going to establish some limits to their violence. And so they are permitted to shed the blood of an animal and eat its flesh, but not its blood, to remind themselves that, that blood, that life is sacred, and they are not permitted to shed the blood of another human, because I want them to remember that they are created in the image of God. So that's kind of where we left our story last week. And so this week, I want to finish up this is kind of like, I guess, an introductory, extended introductory session on violence. And then starting next week, I'd like to start looking more at some of the themes that are related to violence throughout the Bible, rather than on continuing to go through kind of chronologically in the biblical narrative. And so I want to kind of wrap up our discussion of Genesis and how Genesis establishes some of the ground rules for what it is that we're looking at in the rest of the Bible, and how we interpret the Bible in relationship to violence. So I've got 4 passages for us to look at today. And if we don't get to all of them, that's fine. But I want to talk about the Abraham cycle. So we have, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are kind of the main characters that we follow through to the end of the book of Genesis. And so I want to look at what God is doing with that family in relationship to this issue of the violence of humans, and God's desire that we stop being violent, that we find our rightful place in the order of creation, and that we participate in the correct relationships to God, to one another, and to all of the creation. So I want to start with chapter 12 of Genesis, which is where we first meet Abraham. And so we did skip one chapter between Noah and Abraham. And chapter 11 is the story of the Tower of Babel, which I think is sometimes seen as kind of a standalone little interlude. But if we're reading the Bible from the perspective of violence, and what violence means, and how violence works in the world, and what God's doing about violence, I think that the Babel story actually is important as a transition between what we call the primeval stories, the kind of mythological past that establishes the kind of who we are and why we're here types of questions, and then into what is presented as more of a history. It starts to talk about times and places and things like that you don't see in the earlier stories when we get to Abraham. But Babel is kind of the quintessential example of where violence comes from. Violence is self-promotion. Violence is a heightened sense of our own autonomy, our own ability to control the world, to try to make a name for ourselves. We talked about how that same phrase is used there, and then also used in the description of the giants, these heroes that are described at the beginning of the Noah story, that they are making a name for themselves rather than taking on the name that God gives to them, the gift of identity, the gift of a place in the world and a purpose. They don't like what God has given them, and so they want to make their own name. They want to change who they are and how they fit into the world. And from there, if God had allowed them to continue what they were doing, then it would have just continued to descend and to spiral into more and more violence. So from there, now we get to the call of Abraham. And we are going to see there's a pretty radical break with kind of what God had been doing up to this point again. So in the Noah story, God is breaking with the past. God is recreating, destroying the creation, and then creating again. God is attempting to kind of undo the violence that was done by humans at the beginning, but then realizes that the humans aren't going to change. And so God could have chosen to say, okay, well, I'll just keep on doing this until they get the point every single day, like that Calvin quote that I read to you last week. If we got what we deserved, there would be a flood every day to reset, because we're not getting it. God realizes that we're never going to get it from that perspective, from that way of doing things. And so God is going to try something new. God is going to set limits and attempt to break through by participating in the consequences of our pain and the consequences of our violence against each other and ourselves and God. So now we are going to see another break, in that God is choosing a particular person, a particular family, to receive the blessing that God had originally given to the entirety of creation, to all humans. And this is kind of a new attempt to bring about this change, to bring about the nonviolent, peaceful, correct order of the world through this family. So let's take a look then at Genesis chapter 12. And if we've got somebody who would be willing to read, I'd like to start with verses 1 through 9. 1 through 9? Yes, 1 through 9.
I can read.
Wonderful. Thank you, Judy.
Go for it. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev.
All right, thank you. So what do we see in this story in terms of God's actions to set things right, to reestablish those right relationships over against the violence that humans are attempting to push forward? Not super obvious.
Well, he does say in verse 3, he's going to bless those who bless Abram. But whoever curses Abram, God is going to curse. He doesn't say what he's going to do, but he says he's going to curse them.
Mm-hmm. So that might even indicate that God is going to do something violent.
I think God is telling Abram that he will protect him.
Okay. So he will be protected in some way.
Right, and he will protect him from anybody that curses him or does evil to him.
Okay.
Just like I think in the beginning, he was protecting many of the people before the flood, the 7 or 8 people before the flood,
Mm-hmm.
by telling them, go build an ark, sort of thing. So it's a continuation. I see it not as a, let's see, I don't think that it's that evil of the Lord to make that statement to Abram, that he will protect him. I don't look upon that as violence.
Okay. And from the perspective of our biblical definition of violence that we're kind of working with and around and talking through, God is not really capable of doing violence, because violence is about not being in your rightful place in relationship to God. And so God pretty much, can do whatever God wants to do. That's not violent. If God can't do violence to God's own position, because God is at the top. What about the end of verse 3? My translation says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Does anybody have something different than that?
I have all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
Okay. What do you think that means? Are you trying to say something, Karen? We can't hear you.
I pushed the wrong thing.
Oh, okay.
I Is that the first time that he's saving all mankind, all of us? Is he saying that we're all blessed in his sight from that point on?
I mean, through Abraham.
Yeah.
That's
I think it's a
possible.
continuation of the covenant.
Yeah, God did bless everything at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
So this is a re-blessing.
Yeah. Chapter 1, verse 28. God blessed them, the created humans, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of a restatement of the blessing, that now the blessing will be mediated through this one person, this one family, will bring that blessing to everyone on the earth.
How long was this part from the story of Noah?
Well, so that's the thing. Nothing from chapters 1 through 11 have any indication of time
Right.
of attempting to place them in space or time. They do have some of the generational things in there, but those are believed to have been added later to kind of create the whole narrative together, because the purpose of those stories wasn't, when did this happen? The purpose of those stories is, how do these stories help us to understand some of
Right.
the big questions in the world? So I don't think it's attempting to place it in that way. I mean, we could go back and, kind of count the generations, so to speak. If we
No,
wanted
but
to.
what
Chapter
I,
11 does a lineage
Yeah.
down from Noah's sons down to
right. But what I'm thinking is that after Noah and the flood, he said that we were blessed again, that we were not ever going to be wiped out like that.
Mhm.
And then now it's like he's repeating the same
Yeah.
message.
Yeah. And there is a fairly substantial lineage in terms of, the attempt to make those connections. That chapter 10 is an entire lineage, and then you get that little interlude about Babel in the middle, and then the whole rest of chapter 11 is another set of names up until we get to Abram. And so it does seem like there's supposed to be this understanding that it's been a while again, since the last time that God kind of had to reset and reestablish this relationship. So you're right in that. It's kind of the take two, attempt number 3. I don't know, you probably are aware of this, but we as modern jet setters, I don't think we can completely understand just how radical the idea of being called away from your country, your kindred, and your father's house is. There certainly, people were nomads, but to leave your father's house, to leave your kindred, to leave your country, the area where you inhabited, the places that you're familiar with, was not something that was done. Your entire identity was wrapped up in, what tribe you were a member of, who your family was, and whose house you were part of. When the father died, the eldest brother would take over the family, and everybody would continue forward, in the same way, generation after generation, doing whatever it was that they were doing with sheep or, vegetables or whatever it was that they did. And so for God to ask Abram to leave all of that behind and just, go forward, in chapter 11, it says that his father had died. And so we don't know if Abram was the eldest brother or not. He does have some siblings because he's got a nephew, Lot. So we don't know if he would have been the eldest son of Haran. Probably because of the order in which they are listed: Abram, Nahor, and Haran. But it's interesting just to think about, how big a deal that would have been even in the time that these stories were being written down and shared and told and turned into the Bible. The idea of leaving everything behind and setting out would have been, equivalent to what Christopher Columbus did, that we learned about in school. Just kind of, all right, well, I think that there's something over there, so I'm just going to set out and go across the ocean and see what happens. Any other comments on that section? All right, then let's move on and finish up the chapter, verses 10 through 20. Do we have somebody else willing to read that one?
Okay.
I can do it.
Great, thank you.
Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. How far do you want me to read?
The rest of the chapter, please.
Okay. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh, his house, with great plagues. Is that it?
Few more verses.
Because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So the Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they set him on his way with his wife and all that he had.
All right.
That's kind of ugly.
Yeah. So, when if we're kind of looking through this from the perspective of violence and how God deals with violence, and then how we in turn should deal with violence, it seems like Abraham basically, heard God's call, took the call, and then almost immediately did the complete opposite of what it was that he was supposed to be doing. If Abraham, at this point, Abram, is supposed, his call is, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the very first thing that he does after, he goes and goes to where God tells him to go, and makes this altar to the Lord. And then the first big story, the first meaningful interaction that he has is to do the complete opposite of what it is that he's supposed to be doing. He brings, and not, rather than blessings, he brings curses upon the people that he encounters. He assumes that there will be violence, that Pharaoh, or the Egyptians generally, will do violence against him because they want to possess something that is not theirs to possess. They are going to try to take a position in the created order that they do not, that should not be theirs. And so in order to stave off that violence, he decides to do violence of his own. He decides to lie. He decides to establish his own sense of power over the Egyptians by telling them a lie, by controlling them with his manipulative words. And so already, the very first thing that Abram does, besides go where God told him to go, is to kind of violate what it is that he is supposed to be doing. And there are consequences to that. When we read this, just kind of under normal circumstances, without any particular lens on, I see this story as the first threat to the promise, because God did not only promise that Abram would possess the land, but that Abram's offspring would possess the land. And of course, we don't know this yet, but Sarai is barren. He has no offspring at this point. Or maybe we do know it. Maybe they mentioned it at the end of chapter 11. I don't know. But point being that if we know where this is going, if we know that God is attempting to, bring this blessing through these generations after Abraham, and we know that there are no children, then Sarai going into the harem of Pharaoh and being taken away from her husband is the first threat to that promise. But when we add in kind of this lens of violence, it's not only that, but it is Abraham coming at this from the completely wrong perspective. He is traveling and he doesn't trust God to protect him and protect his wife. And so he goes about things his own way. He decides that he's going to take matters into his own hands and protect himself by creating this lie. And it was a pretty dumb way to go about it, because yes, he's alive and he's got, sheep and oxen and stuff, but he doesn't have his wife. His wife has been taken by the Pharaoh. And so, how does that even solve the problem? It doesn't. And so God has to intervene to reestablish the correct relationships again. Anything sticking out to you there? Comments, thoughts, ideas?
Just an interesting ploy to keep himself alive in his mind.
Yeah. But doesn't really think it through very well, I don't think.
And the Pharaoh didn't kill him.
No.
No, he could have killed him
Mm-hmm.
and all the servants and everything, but he just told him, take your wife and go.
Yeah, get out of here. Anything else? All right. Well, next we're going to hop forward a little bit to chapter 18. We're going to look at verses 16 through 19. So this is verses 16 through 19 are the beginning, the introduction to the kind of interlude about Sodom and Gomorrah. So right before this, this passage that we're going to read, we have the story of the messengers or angels or men or whoever they are who come to announce to Abraham that his wife is going to have a baby, and Sarah overhears it and she laughs. And so that's the story that comes immediately before this. And then the story that comes immediately after is God explaining to Abraham what's going to happen to Sodom and why, and then Abraham and God kind of negotiating over this, which is a really interesting story on its own to think about. God being talked down from doing something, or attempted to talk God down from doing something. But I wanted to just look at just the very introduction to that story, because it tells us more explicitly than chapter 12 the reason why Abraham was called. What is his purpose? Why did God call? Why did God decide that this one individual was going to receive the blessing in order to bless the world? And how does that work? So do we have someone who could read verses 16 through 19 for us, please?
Yeah, I can read it here.
Great.
18 to 19.
When the men got up to leave, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him."
Okay, thank you. So once again, we see the blessing for all the nations mentioned here. That my translation says all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. And in this particular case, God is kind of debating about whether or not to tell Abraham about this plan for Sodom. But this kind of overhearing of the thoughts of God within the context of the story helps to give us some additional information about what it means to be a blessing to all nations. Because it says, "For I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." So keeping the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, or doing righteousness and justice, these two words in Hebrew don't appear very often in Genesis, but they are incredibly important in this particular passage. They are expressing to us that Abraham's purpose, and God chose Abraham so that Abraham could defend the order of creation, defend that which promotes life, defend that which promotes well-being of relationships that humans have with each other and with God and with all of creation. And so I think that this passage is actually, in a lot of ways, could be seen as kind of the establishing passage, the introduction to the entirety of the Hebrew scriptures. What is the point of being part of God's family? What is the point of being a descendant of Abraham, a child of God? The point is that you are to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. The point is that you are supposed to follow God. You are supposed to live within the position that God has given you and promote life, promote the well-being of all creatures, promote right relationships with other humans, promote right relationships with creation, and promote right relationships with God. And so we're going to see, as we go through that, the different ways that we do this and the things that happen in the way that they are described and addressed by different speakers will change, but that commitment to that core purpose does not change. So, for example, we'll get into some of the prophets, and especially the minor prophets really get into economic justice and talking about how it's wrong that there are people who don't have enough to eat, who don't have a place to live, who don't have anything to wear. And God is displeased with what the people think is what God wants is the sacrifices. And so we have places, like in Isaiah or Hosea, a lot of the different ones say these kinds of things, but I despise your festivals. I don't want your sacrifices. I want you to do what is right, to do what is just, to walk humbly with me, to stop being violent, to stop trying to step out of your place, to stop trying to get a leg up on other people. I am here. I'm to protect you, to give you what you need. Your job is not to build up your own empire. Your job is to build up my kingdom. And to build up my kingdom, you need to use your resources appropriately. You need to make sure that there's no one among you who is hungry. There is no reason why you should be feasting during my festival when there are people on the street who don't have anything to eat. And so that's kind of where those people get with this. But I think any of the kind of threads that we could follow through the Hebrew scriptures come from this place. But I think that this particular calling to be the special people of God, to have this special privilege, is often misconstrued, misunderstood. The calling is both a privilege and a responsibility. With great power comes great privilege and great responsibility. But I think there's this mandate that if we're going to be the people of God, if we're going to respond to this call, then we are expected to live out of God's love in all areas of our lives. But instead, many times, people who identify themselves with Abraham, whether it's because they are Jewish at certain times in history, or more recently, and certainly much more to much more ill effect, Christians have claimed this blessing of Abraham for themselves, and instead of understanding that that is a call, that is a responsibility, they use the story to abuse others, to put themselves in positions above others, to ironically use the very mechanism that God is attempting to use to prevent violence, to actually increase the violence, to put themselves into positions that they don't deserve and where they don't belong, to attempt to overrule God's authority and establish their own authority and their own position above others. So I think that is unfortunately kind of where we as humans end up. So what do we think about any of those comments? Any examples that you can think of situations like I was talking about? Do you think that there's a way to fix that?
Fix it. That's a big one. Well, the original idea I've always felt and been taught was that really the Christian feeling is really a socialism, is what Christ wanted us to have, taking care of one another. And in small areas, that works out well. I was fortunate enough to be in a kibbutz for a little while. It was very nice. It was enjoyable. They took care of everybody. And I believe our churches do the same this day, but it gets corrupted by other people coming in that don't have the true meaning of it. And that's what I look upon as the things you were talking about with Abraham, is that he had his own little, God wanted us to have our own little kibbutz, and then to help others and branch out from there. So.
Okay. When I think about abusing the position of kind of being God's people, I guess it's almost it's probably almost a defense defense mechanism, that I don't go immediately in my head to my own context. I go to places like the Crusades, that, well, of course it was wrong for these people to claim the banner of God and go and murder all of these Muslims because they weren't Christians, and try to force them to convert, and to take over these lands. They weren't really there because they wanted to bring God's love to other people. They were there to take control of land and get more power and money, and to expand their empires. But they used this blessing. They used this identity as part of the children of Abraham, and therefore inheritors of that blessing, to kind of rile each other up and to convince themselves that they were doing what was right, even though I think at the heart of hearts, in their hearts of hearts, they knew what they were doing was wrong. And of course, we do the same thing today in many ways.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, is that, he was saying, take care of yourself first, but don't take care of yourself at the expense of everybody else, or the needy that are outside your gate, or you have to take care of them too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we fail. We've always failed at that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he keeps telling us to do that.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me, when we're talking about this using this violence lens, if we think about that passage from the Noah story that we read the last time, where God acknowledges that we are corrupt from our youth. It says we are evil from our youth. We are incapable of not acting violently. And so if, you know, if the process, if we ignore for a moment the challenges of God kind of, you know, working through how to deal with this, and God changing tactics and things like that can be challenging. If we ignore that for a moment, we could say, so God created the world and it was good, and God blessed it and said, I want you to be your own creation and be in relationship with me and each other in a really positive way, but I'm not going to force you to do anything because you need to have your own will, your own ability to respond. And then, you know, then they immediately they start doing the wrong things and sin and start doing violence to one another. And then it gets to the point where it's so bad that God says, well, I'm going to try again because this is getting really bad. And then come around to the end of the Noah story and saying, okay, well, that didn't work. And I know that it's not going to work. And so instead of doing this again, I'm going to make you a promise that I will never do it again. I will become more patient with you. I will become more gracious to you. And then over time again, it's, you know, still not working. And so now this time I'm going to decide, well, maybe this time I'll choose a particular person, a particular family, and work through them. Why would you do that if you know that anybody you choose is going to be just as corrupt, just as bad as everybody else is? Why would you choose to work through the humans to bring that blessing to the world? And so it feels like an honor, you know, to be chosen by God to be part of what God is doing in the world, and we talk about that a lot. But it's also incredibly humbling that, you know, why would God do that? Why that just sounds like the stupidest idea. But, you know, when I think about things like, well, sometimes my kids want to help fold the laundry, and I know that they're going to do a terrible job and that the laundry is going to come out looking horrible and all the clothes are going to be wrinkled. But my child wants to do it. My child wants to have this relationship with me in this moment and wants to participate, wants to try. And so I have to give that opportunity, even if it means that we're going to, you know, send Bob off to church wearing a wrinkly clergy shirt next week. So in some ways, you know, you can maybe think about it from that perspective, that God doesn't need us. God certainly knows that asking us to do it is going to result in a terrible job being done, not just in terms of it not being done right, but us doing actually the opposite of what it is that we're supposed to be doing. But God wants that relationship with us, and so God is choosing to allow us to stumble through and make those mistakes, but then also to work through us to bring about occasionally those small glimpses of God's real movement in the world. And I think that is, you know, if we keep that as our perspective, I think that's how we avoid some of those missteps of the Crusades and these other, you know, other examples of people using that privilege to abuse others.
Right.
It's a privilege, but it's also a huge responsibility, and one that we must take very seriously and constantly be humbled by and grateful for. So that's what I would say. Any other thoughts on this one?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well.
All right. Well, then let's hop on just to the very last passage I wanted to look at today, which is all the way in Genesis chapter 50, 5-0. So we have kind of skipped over, you know, the entire Abraham cycle. We've skipped over the birth of Isaac and the stories of Isaac and how Jacob did violence to his family by stealing his brother's birthright and stealing his brother's blessing and running away from home. And then his uncle did violence to him by cheating him out of the wife that he wanted. And so he had to take on 2 wives, and that resulted in fighting among the brothers because of the different relationships and favoritism and all these different things. And then we get Joseph, who, you know, ends up going into slavery because his brothers do violence to him and he does violence to his brothers. We're going to skip through all of that, knowing that all of that exists. And we're going to go to the very end of the story. And starting with chapter 50, which is the very last chapter in Genesis, verse 15, and we'll read 15 through 21. So do we have one last reader available?
I can do it.
All right, great.
It starts, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask that you forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came upon him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. I am in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done and saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he assured them and spoke kindly to them.
All right. Thanks, Steve.
Sure.
So we've got kind of some allusions to some of the other violent acts that we skipped over, with the brothers sending, you know, throwing him in the pit and sending him into slavery in Egypt and all the terrible things that happened to Joseph while he was in Egypt, but then also the blessings that he received from God and the position and the authority that he was given by Pharaoh because of his abilities that were given to him by God. So we're definitely alluding to the violence that people do to each other, and even within God's family, God's chosen people. But I think, you know, verse 19, the second half of verse 19 is kind of the heart of the matter. Am I in the place of God? So Joseph is saying here, you know, the only way to stop this cycle of violence is for me to step out of that position of feeling like I have the right to vengeance. I have the right to do against you, you know, what you have done to me or more. The only way to move forward here is to accept that God is in God's place and I am not. And so God is the one who gets to decide what happens to you, and God is the one who decides how we are in relationship with one another. Terrible things have happened to me. You wanted terrible things to happen to me, but God used your intentions. God used your bad actions. God used your violence and brought good from it, so that now I am in this position where I'm able to save all of these lives because of the famine that's in the land. But because I knew about it, because I was able to come up with an idea for how to handle it, now look, all these people have been able to live because of me and because of what God has done through me. So don't be afraid, because I'm not going to put myself in the position that you put yourselves in. I am not going to attempt to take God's authority. I'm going to maintain my place in the created order. I'm going to maintain the relationships that God wants me to have with you in the way that you did not and that you should have. So I think that kind of, you know, is intentionally placed at this place in this story, that if we're looking at the entire book of Genesis from the perspective of what is violence, how did violence enter into the world, how was violence handled by God, and now as we exit this story, right at the very end, just before we get to the story of how Joseph died, he says, Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. And so when we're reading this from that perspective, I think that's kind of what we've got. It summarizes the narrative of Genesis. It wraps it up into a neat little bow for us as we enter into the next phase of this journey toward reconciliation, toward removing violence, toward reestablishing that right relationship with God. Thoughts on that?
I have a question.
Sure.
Did the brothers lie? Did their father really say this, or did the brothers come up with this passage so that Joseph wouldn't hold a grudge against them, or they were worried about what Joseph might do to them? Did they come up with this?
I mean, my version seems to indicate so. It says,
Mhm.
realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's mother said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge and decides to pay us back?" So they approached Joseph saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died." So the grammar of that sentence does seem to indicate that they created this story in an attempt to prevent Joseph from harming them, in an attempt to stave off. So it is interesting from that perspective, because what are the two stories that we just looked at kind of as bookends? We've got Abraham in Egypt lying to save his own skin. And then at the very end, we've got the descendants of Abraham in Egypt lying to save their own skin.
The great-grandsons.
Yeah.
So that's what mine says too, and that's the way I interpret it, that we got to save our lives. So this is what we're going to tell Joseph.
Yeah. But then Joseph doesn't respond in the same way. Abraham lied, and Pharaoh got mad at him and sent him away, which, could have been a lot worse than that. The brothers lie, and Joseph says, "It doesn't matter, because I'm not going to do anything to you anyway, because who I am
Not God.
is not God." But yeah, it does create a nice little bookend to the whole story.
It also shows that how you respond to situations is important. That if Joseph had been like me, he would have been so angry with his brothers, he wouldn't have been able to do that. But sometimes the only thing you can change about a situation is your attitude and the way you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what Joseph did, is he had a choice between how to respond, to respond with anger or to respond with love.
Mm-hmm.
And he chose love.
Mm-hmm.
He chose God.
Yeah.
So
Could Pharaoh,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Could Pharaoh have said the same thing? I'm fascinated by why Pharaoh took such an easy approach to the situation of Abraham. Was he also saying, without knowing it, am I to be like God in vengeance, or what? I mean, it doesn't sound like the Pharaoh's words to me.
Yeah, no, it definitely, we've definitely got to read into it a little bit, that God was there protecting Abraham, and being kicked out of Egypt probably would have not been a great thing at that time, because if there was a famine in the land and that's why they went there, then that would have been challenging for them. Although now they've got all these sheep and oxes and donkeys and male and female slaves and what have you that were handed over to them by Pharaoh. But I think that's way better than what should have happened, which would have been that Pharaoh destroyed all of it because out of anger for what was done. So yeah, I mean, I don't know that those words are certainly not there, but the intention is sort of there.
Mhm. Mhm.
Jacob didn't die right after he came to Egypt. There was a period of time, wasn't there? I mean, it's not like he arrived in Egypt and died.
Right. Yeah. There's
So during that time, Joseph didn't do anything to the family. You would think that the brothers would realize that Joseph was not going to harm them.
I guess they're thinking that now that the father is dead, sometimes people wait while their parents are still alive and pretend like they are still getting along just for the sake of the parents, and then
Now we fight over the inheritance.
right. Any other thoughts?
Well, they had some time to think about it because I read the pre-chapter and it's talking about Jacob dying and all the funeral stuff that went place, and they all traveled together, and so they had a lot of time to come up with their little plot to tell them.
Yeah, it's true. Oh, here it is, Judy. It says in chapter 47, it says Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So Jacob brought everybody down to Egypt and established themselves there for 17 years before he died.
Right.
So yeah, his brothers were there for almost 2 decades worrying about this, I guess.
Talk about high anxiety.
Yeah.
Well, they did some pretty nasty things to the guy.
This is true.
But it was all part of God's plan.
Yeah, they didn't know that.
No, we do. And when Joseph was in prison, the Pharaoh could have killed him. Pocahontas could have gone to the Pharaoh and said, he violated my wife. And Pharaoh could have killed him.
Mhm.
He got rid of was it the butler?
Yep.
But the wine steward got to, so I mean, he lived all this time in the thing and he was not, Pharaoh didn't set his execution date. So
This is true. Any other thoughts on any of this? And not just necessarily this particular passage, but anything we've talked about today or not talked about today.
It just seems like throughout all of this that we've been reading that, situations get set up and invariably the people act in violence, you know, in
Mm.
separating themselves from God, invariably. I mean,
Mm.
even well, all of them. I mean, it's just, and then God, you can see God's hand protecting them throughout, and they still keep doing it. I just, and we still keep doing it today. You know, it's
Yep.
when will we ever learn?
On
Yes.
the last day.
Yeah, I mean, God must just throw up his hands every day and say, what are these people doing?
I certainly would.
I like
Yeah,
what you summarized, kind of Genesis of, clear in the beginning when God created everything, it was good. And that's what God intends, even for now, despite ourselves, God intends things to be good.
mhm.
Creation. And one day it will be again.
Despite us. Not
Despite
because of
us.
us, for sure.
Trying
He
to get
keeps-
our
He keeps
attention.
loving us. He keeps loving us through it all.
Yep.
I just don't see why we keep getting so far off course. It especially right now, it seems like there's so much ugliness and violence, and we just keep getting there. We just keep doing it, doing it, doing it. It doesn't solve any problem.
Mm-hmm.
And just like the wars and everything, but as far back as you can go, as far back as Genesis, it's always been there. It's always been part of our human condition.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And it should all be turning us to God, shouldn't it?
it should.
Yeah.
Think that we can't do this on our own, clearly.
Yeah.
but does it? Instead all this greed gets in the way and
Yep. Well, I think it does turn us to God, but then we forget about it. We get lax, we get easygoing, and then that's when the devil can step in and, like he did with Eve, and we eat the apple all over again.
It's easy to, when things are going well, it's easy for us to believe that we did that, to feel
We did that.
pride.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
And if I can do that, then I can do this too. I can be in charge.
Yeah. Well, he certainly works hard at trying to get our attention.
We're a little bit deaf.
Mhm.
Or maybe a
well,
lot.
and sometimes, you look outside right now and all this smoke and everything and terrible air and it's just amazing to me that our earth can clean itself and come back to healthiness. And it's because of how God created it all. And,
Mhm.
it's really amazing the power of creation and what God's done. We lose sight of that a lot.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Very true. All right. Well, we have reached 12:30. I think that we can wrap it up for today. Thank you all for new interesting insights for me to ponder and for coming and sharing this time with me. I'm really enjoying this and coming at some of these same stories that we're very familiar with this fresh lens to understand it from a completely new perspective. I'm really having a great time with this. So thanks for being here today. Next week, we're going to start looking at a little bit, kind of taking a different tactic. And I'm going to start talking about just some kind of themes about violence. I think we might start with God as warrior, because in Exodus we get this, God in battle against Pharaoh and this kind of thing, and start talking a little bit about God as a warring general rather than as the peaceful and nonviolent creator that we see in Genesis 1. And then from there, we'll pick some other themes and continue to work through kind of picking out some different threads and move forward that way. Sound good?
Yes.
All right. Well, then have a wonderful week, and I will see you all on Thursday next.
See you next. Sounds good.
All right. Have a great
Okay.
week.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.